Welcome back to the deep dive. So what we're trying to do here, really, is pretty simple. We take all this complex, sometimes overwhelming source material, the research, the clinical notes, and we boil it down to the stuff you actually need.
Hmm.
And today we're tackling something that I think almost everyone has experienced at some point, and yet we almost completely misunderstand it. It's that frustrating experience of lying awake, not just struggling to sleep, but struggling with the frantic, racing thoughts about the sleep you're losing.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you've been there, if you've watched the clock go from, say, 1 a.m. to 3 a.m.,
Yeah.
this feeling isn't just being tired. It's this intense agitation.
Right.
And you realize pretty quickly that the problem stops being just a biological thing, a need for rest, and it sort of morphs into this huge cognitive and emotional struggle. You're not just awake, you're worrying about being awake.
That's the classic spiral, isn't it? And it's a really vicious one. You might, start out just trying to fall asleep, but then within minutes, your brain just completely shifts gears.
Yeah.
It starts calculating the hours you've lost, predicting how awful tomorrow is going to be, and just generating this endless noise inside your head. You go from wanting rest to feeling completely revved up, or as our sources call it, you're in a state of hyperarousal.
And that hyperarousal,
Mhm.
that's the core engine that keeps chronic insomnia going. So that's exactly what this deep dive is all about. We're focusing completely on the cognitive part of it. It's not enough to, just fix your bedroom or cut out caffeine. We have to get at how your fundamental thoughts, your assumptions, your beliefs, how they keep this whole exhausting cycle going.
So our mission today is to give you the tools to stop being just a passive victim of that mental chatter. We're going to tackle these unhelpful thoughts using two really powerful evidence-based strategies that come straight from the shared sources. The first is the constructive worry technique, which is super practical.
Mhm.
And the second is the thought record, which is much more analytical. These are kind of the cognitive hammers you're going to use to break that thought loop.
Right, but before we hand over the tools, I think we have to name the villain here because it really needs a name. The insomnia brain. And this isn't just a metaphor for, being in a bad mood at night. It's a very specific and highly problematic way of thinking that is directly associated with and helps fuel chronic sleep loss.
I find that definition incredibly validating because the sources point out that this insomnia brain is often totally distinct from how you normally think during the day.
Oh, completely.
You could be a really organized, calm, reasonable person, great at problem solving, but at night you become this agitated, obsessive person who can only see the worst case scenario. Why? Why does that split happen?
Well, it's largely a mix of your environment and, frankly, our evolutionary wiring. I mean, when you're alone in the dark and your body's supposed to be shutting down, that quiet creates a kind of vacuum. And if you already have chronic sleep deprivation, your brain is already sensitized to stress. So the key thing about the insomnia brain is that it's just incredibly noisy. It's obsessively focused on all the negative things that will happen if you don't sleep, the impact on your health, your work, your mood.
And this is where the real problem takes hold, right?
Yeah.
Even if you have some physiological issue that starts your insomnia, it's the cognitive reaction to that issue that keeps it going long term.
Exactly. As the sources put it so well, how we think and feel has this huge impact on how we sleep. And these negative thoughts, they spread like wildfire once you get into bed.
We need to unpack that wildfire idea a bit more because it's the escalation that's so dangerous. You mentioned it a minute ago.
Yep.
You start with a small, manageable worry. Let's say it's just, remembering to schedule a dentist appointment.
Right? A simple task. But
Yeah.
the insomnia brain takes that and it runs it through this series of "and then what?" questions.
So the inner monologue becomes something like, okay, I forgot the dentist. I'm so disorganized. If I can't even remember that, I'm definitely going to fail on that big project at work. And if I fail that, I'll look incompetent. My boss will lose faith in me. I'll get passed over for a promotion or maybe even fired.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And just like that, in that moment, the brain has jumped from a simple logistical task to this catastrophic fear about career failure, financial ruin.
Yeah.
And that level of extreme negative thinking, it triggers your fight or flight response, your cortisol levels spike, your heart rate goes up, and your brain enters that state of hyperarousal.
Right.
And sleep is, well, it's physiologically impossible when your system thinks you're facing an existential threat.
So the critical insight here, and the sources are really clear on this, is that all habits, even mental and emotional ones, they can be broken.
Yeah.
You just need an effective strategy. You have sort of unintentionally trained your brain to worry aggressively at night, so now we're going to strategically retrain it.
That's right. And we start with the immediate behavior, the action that breaks the physical cycle. before we even get into the deeper cognitive work.
Okay, let's unpack that. Let's start with that immediate behavioral countersignal, the thing that helps quiet the noise before we even touch something like the constructive worry worksheet.
So the first, most fundamental step in fighting the insomnia brain, it involves a concept called stimulus control. We have to establish the correct and singular signal for the bed. As we've discussed, for many people with insomnia, the second their head hits the pillow, their brain just immediately jumps to worry, analysis, upset. The bed itself has become a conditioned stimulus for being awake and anxious.
And that conditioning is really powerful. If you lie in bed every night for 3 hours, tossing and turning, checking your phone, agonizing about your life, your brain stops seeing the bed as a place for safety and rest. It
Yes.
starts seeing it as a place for performance anxiety and problem solving. It becomes a signal for being hyper alert, not for sleep.
That is the problem. Your behavioral history in that environment is actively working against you. And that is why the foundational advice, the absolute anchor of all cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, is so critical. If you cannot sleep, you must get out of bed and leave the room.
Okay, now I get the principle, I do. But I have to be the skeptical listener here for a second. When I am exhausted and just so frustrated at 3 in the morning, the idea of getting up, walking to another room, and just sitting there, it feels like the absolute last thing I want to do. It just feels like wasted effort. So how rigid does this rule have to be? Like, what's the cutoff time?
That feeling of resistance, that's the insomnia brain. It's trying to trick you back into that negative cycle. And the rule, unfortunately, has to be rigid. The sources are very clear. If you can't fall asleep after maybe 15 or 20 minutes, or if you wake up in the night and can't get back to sleep quickly, you have to get out of bed. Staying in
Oh.
bed while you're wide awake and distressed, that just reinforces the negative association.
So what's the deep down reason for making this effort, especially when you're feeling so sluggish and heavy?
Well, the rationale is twofold, and it's profound. First, getting out of bed immediately interrupts that problematic mental activity. You are physically removing your hyper-aroused brain from the environment where it learned to worry. It breaks that powerful, conditioned link between the mattress and being alert. You are sending a clear signal. The bed is not the place for activity, for worry, for analysis, or for problem solving.
So you're reprogramming the environment itself. You're basically telling your brain, look, if we are in here, we are sleeping. If we are not sleeping, we physically go somewhere else to do our thinking.
Exactly. But the second part is just as important. What you do when you are out of bed. It has to be a low-activity, non-stimulating task. You have to avoid screens, work, bills, anything that engages that problem-solving insomnia brain.
What kind of low activity is okay then? Can I just scroll through social media on my phone?
Absolutely not. And the sources are very specific here. The goal is to lower your arousal, not just switch the focus of it. Scrolling on a screen introduces bright blue light, which suppresses melatonin, and the content itself stimulates your analytical mind. So, acceptable low-activity tasks are things like reading a physical book, maybe something a little boring, or listening to quiet, calming music, or doing a very simple, non-stressful hobby like some light stretching or even folding laundry. And the moment you feel sleepy, you go back to bed.
Ah, okay. So the goal isn't to find a distraction that keeps you entertained. The goal is to find an activity that is so dull that your brain basically decides sleep is the better option.
Precisely. You're using boredom and the removal from the comfortable bed as this sort of subtle motivator for sleepiness. And when you do go back to bed later, after your brain has been less active or racing, your chances of falling asleep go up significantly. You're making sure that when you're in the bed, your mental activity is very low, which reinforces that positive sleep signal.
How long does this reprogramming take? Is this something that gives you immediate relief, or are we talking about weeks of pretty difficult, consistent behavior change?
The first few nights can be frustrating, for sure. But the sources indicate that if you consistently apply stimulus control, along with the other techniques we're about to discuss, you can start to reestablish that positive sleep signal relatively quickly, often within a couple of weeks. The brain learns fast when the rules are consistent.
And the source material also highlights another benefit that I think often gets overlooked, taking the insomnia brain out of the bed. It actually helps people become more clear-headed and better at switching off their thinking during the daytime as well.
Yes, it becomes a systemic change. You're building better mental boundaries, really, 24 hours a day. That mental discipline, which you get by spending time out of bed when you're active, it helps reduce the underlying anxiety that's driving the whole cycle. You're proactively managing your arousal.
Okay, so that's the immediate behavioral intervention, the response to being awake. Now, let's talk about a structured way to drain that worry tank before you even get to the pillow. Because even with the best stimulus control, a lot of people are kept awake by what the sources call unfinished business.
This brings us to constructive worry, or CW. The rationale behind it is simple, but it's really profound. Many people with insomnia complain that they have this backlog of problems, tasks, emotional loose ends from the day that they just haven't had time to deal with. And this leads to a flood of mental arousal right when they're trying to transition to sleep.
This is such a classic modern life problem. We rush through our days, putting out fires, responding to emails, and we just postpone anything that requires deep thought or emotional processing. Bedtime is often the first quiet moment the brain has all day,
Hmm.
and it just seizes that opportunity.
It really does. The brain just says, aha. Finally, quiet, now is my chance to review the entire list of possible disasters, plan next week's budget, and relive that awkward conversation from lunch. And all of that forced processing, it prevents sleep. It creates this mental arousal in the pre-sleep period.
So the constructive worry technique is basically a psychological trick. You schedule a dedicated, time-limited window for all that worrying and problem solving, and by doing that, you give your brain permission to postpone those thoughts until the scheduled time.
That's precisely right. CW is a highly structured, scheduled method. It's designed to make sure that problem solving happens entirely outside of the sleep period. We're teaching the brain that the thoughts are important, yes, but they have a designated parking spot.
Let's get into the specifics, because the critique we saw really highlighted that we need to emphasize how critical timing and structure are for this to work. So I have to be the skeptic again. If I only have 30 minutes free right before bed, why can't I just do it then? Why is the timing so rigid?
That rigidity is the key to its success. The sources really emphasize that timing is critical. This exercise has to take place in the late afternoon or early evening, at least 2 hours before you plan to go to bed. And why 2 hours? Well, you need a substantial buffer period for the physiological effects of problem solving, the mild mental stimulation, the emotional activation to dissipate. If you start aggressively solving problems 5 minutes before turning out the lights, you're just activating the insomnia brain right at the threshold of sleep.
So you need that cognitive cool down period.
Exactly. And furthermore, you have to strictly limit the exercise itself. It should only take about 15 minutes to complete. This dedicated, non-negotiable time frame is what trains the brain to postpone worry. So if a worry starts to creep in during the day or later at night, you can use the mantra, I don't have to deal with that now. I have a dedicated time for it later.
Okay, let's walk through the set of concrete steps using that constructive worry worksheet format. This is where it gets really practical.
Step 1. Identify concerns. You need a physical mechanism for this, usually just a piece of paper with 2 columns, concerns and solutions. You write down the problems you're facing that you think have the greatest chance of keeping you awake. And be specific, not vague. Don't write, work is stressful. Write, I need to finish the Q3 report, or I need to sort out that scheduling conflict with Jennifer.
Okay, and step 2 is the constructive part. Generate solutions or next steps. For each specific concern, you list the next concrete step or series of steps you could take in the solutions column. And the really important thing here, as the sources note, is that the solution does not have to be the final, perfect resolution to the problem. That's the trap the insomnia brain falls into. It demands an instant, total fix.
And we should probably detail the specific writing guidelines for those next steps because they vary depending on the type of problem. So if the problem can be fixed completely and easily, say, by sending 1 email, you write that specific action down. Send email to vendor X at 9 a.m. tomorrow.
And if it's a smaller problem, maybe more emotional, and you decide you'll just deal with it when the time comes, you acknowledge that decision. You write down, this isn't a major issue. I will address it calmly if it comes up tomorrow. Just the act of labeling it as manageable gives you a sense of closure.
And if you're genuinely stumped and you don't know what to do and your brain just keeps circling the problem, the next step often isn't a solution, but an information gathering action. So you write down, ask my manager for clarification on policy X, or call a friend who's dealt with this before. The solution is to get help.
And this brings us to what I think is the most frustrating category for listeners. The problems with no good solution, the things you just have to live with, an ongoing health issue maybe, or a difficult family situation. What do you write down for those?
For those, the cognitive action is one of acceptance, and then planning for emotional support. You still write a note to yourself about that reality. For example, this is an ongoing difficulty that I have to manage. I will schedule time tomorrow to talk to my therapist about coping strategies. You acknowledge the reality, and then you move on from trying to fix the unfixable in the middle of the night. You're making a plan for management, not a plan for a miracle.
Okay, so step 3 is simple but necessary. Repeat and address all concerns. You just go through every single distracting item on your list until the sheet is full.
And then step 4 is crucial for the psychological shift: storage. Once the 15 minutes are up and you have to stick to that time limit, even if your list isn't complete, you fold the worksheet in half and you physically place it on your nightstand or in a drawer, and then you forget about it until the next day.
That physical act of folding it and putting it away, that must be a kind of symbolic closure for the brain, right? You're literally putting the worries to bed for the night.
Exactly. It reinforces that boundary. This work is done for today.
Now, what happens if that worry starts to bubble up again later when you're trying to sleep? Because the insomnia brain doesn't give up easily. That's step 5, the bedtime reminder.
So if that familiar worry starts, you have to engage in a firm internal dialogue. You remind yourself that you've already dealt with those problems. You say, I've addressed this. The solutions are on the nightstand. And crucially, you tell yourself that nothing you do while you're tired and half asleep is going to make it better. You'll work on it tomorrow when you're clear-headed.
And this reinforces the boundary you set earlier. You're effectively delaying the processing until the designated time. You're training your brain to trust the system you've put in place. And finally, step 6 just confirms the added value. The sources note that this technique often leads to less anxiety during the daytime as well, not just at night, because you're consistently draining that reservoir of stress.
Let's make this really concrete by looking deeper into the example from the source material about a really vague worry like money. A global anxiety like money is useless at 2 in the morning. It just triggers panic. Constructive worry demands that you get specific. So a good solution isn't just make more money. It's broken down into 4 distinct, actionable steps.
For instance, something like, I will make an appointment with our financial planner tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. Or, I will research options for that extra freelance project. These are actions of execution.
Or even smaller, defensive actions like, I will wait until my credit card statement is due to pay it to maximize float. Or, I will review my subscription list and cut out my recurring latte purchases for the next month. You've taken this global, paralyzing anxiety and you've distilled it into 4 achievable, specific, distinct steps that you've already committed to address.
I can really see why this works. The mental energy it takes to solve problems at 3 a.m. is enormous, and it's totally ineffective. The constructive worry period captures that energy, it channels it into a productive window, and it provides psychological closure, leaving the rest of the night free for rest.
The beauty of CW is that it manages the content of the worries, the specific tasks and problems. But that brings us to our second major tool, which is necessary because sometimes the problem isn't the to-do list, it's the deep-seated, irrational beliefs about sleep itself.
Okay, so now we're shifting our focus from practical problems to more abstract fears. Constructive worry handles the specific list of problems from your day. The thought record, on the other hand, handles the persistent, catastrophic thoughts and beliefs about sleep itself. We're talking about fears like the idea that you won't be able to cope the next day, or that you're losing control of your mind, or even becoming seriously ill because of lack of sleep.
And these thoughts are exponentially scarier than the car not working or a bill being due. They aren't about the logistics of life. They're about the idea of your personal integrity. The fear of going crazy or becoming completely dysfunctional if the insomnia keeps going. They can feel terrifying because they attack your core sense of competence and control.
And these beliefs are expressed as automatic thoughts. Can you elaborate on that term? What makes an automatic thought different from a regular worry?
Automatic thoughts are reflexive. They're problematic mental intrusions that just pop up without any conscious effort or logical consideration. They are the insomnia brain's default programming, often short, intense statements like, this is hopeless, or I can't handle this. They're the immediate internal commentary that just springs into existence when you experience a moment of frustration or perceived failure. And the thought record is the formal, structured tool designed to expose and combat these intrusive and often distorted reflexive thoughts.
So the thought record isn't just journaling or venting, it's a systematic method of mental reprogramming. We're going beyond just clearing the to-do list and diving deep into the assumptions that hold the whole insomnia structure together.
Absolutely. Its purpose is to curb the insomnia brain's tendency to operate purely on confirmation bias, focusing only on the negative and the worst-case scenarios of sleep loss. The goal is complex: to balance your thoughts, to challenge those negative beliefs systematically, and to generalize anxiety-reducing coping statements, which leads directly to greater mental clarity and less fatigue during the day.
So to really execute the thought record, you almost have to become a thought detective. You need to identify what type of cognitive error you're making. The sources outline a really powerful list of common errors that the insomnia brain relies on. I think we should dedicate some serious time to these because just understanding the error is half the battle.
Agreed. Let's run through the 8 core categories of unhelpful thinking that the thought record helps us spot and dismantle.
Okay, first up is misattribution.
Right. Misattribution happens when you attribute a negative mood, a momentary lapse in memory, or poor performance entirely to a lack of sleep, when in reality, other factors, environmental, biological, situational, might be the real cause. The insomnia brain uses any negative feeling as definitive proof that the lack of sleep has completely ruined you.
This is so critical because some things we blame on sleep loss are actually just normal biology that even well-rested people experience. The source material highlights 2 great examples: sleep inertia and the post-lunch dip.
Sleep inertia is that grogginess you feel for the first 30 to 60 minutes after you wake up. You feel heavy, your thinking is slow, you might stumble over words. That decline in mental function is a normal biological phenomenon as your brain transitions out of sleep. But the insomnia brain immediately misattributes it. I feel terrible, therefore, last night ruined me.
And the post-lunch dip. That's the mid-afternoon energy drop.
Yes. That decline in mental function in the early afternoon is a global phenomenon. It's related to a dip in your core body temperature and your natural circadian rhythm. It is not necessarily proof that you're completely unable to function after a poor night's sleep. It's so powerful to realize that you're not failing. Your body is just following a rhythm that affects everyone. Recognizing these patterns reduces the anxiety that fuels that misattribution.
Okay, next up is emotional reasoning.
Emotional reasoning is when you view anxious or stressed feelings as objective, factual evidence. The internal logic is flawed. I feel anxious and dreadful right now, therefore I will not sleep and tomorrow will be a disaster. This belief is accepted as a factual prophecy, which then directly leads to more anxiety, making the prediction, the inability to sleep, pretty much guaranteed.
And the listener knows this feeling, that heavy dread in your chest. The insomnia brain says, trust the dread. It knows the truth. But what we're saying is the dread is just a feeling. It's not a fortune teller.
Exactly. It's confusing a subjective emotional state with an objective external reality. The thought record forces you to separate the feeling. Anxiety is at 80% from the potential fact, I will fail tomorrow.
Let's move to the very rigid all-or-nothing thinking.
This is that black and white extreme thinking. The listener says, I didn't sleep at all last night. This is a classic example. If you believe you got 0 minutes of sleep, you have categorized the night as a complete and total failure.
But the sources stress that this is almost never true, right? Total wakefulness for 8 hours straight without moving is highly unlikely.
It is. The insomnia brain minimizes or completely ignores fragmented rest. The sources suggest checking your sleep diaries. Did you get up? Did you doze off for a few minutes while watching TV in the other room? Did you lie still and rest for an hour? All-or-nothing thinking demands 100% perfect sleep, or it's 100% failure. The thought record challenges this by pointing out the reality of fragmented rest, which is still rest.
Which brings us into the area of highest distress, catastrophizing.
This is the habit of drastically overestimating the negative consequences of poor sleep. This is where that spiral goes completely off the rails, often centered around the fear of becoming non-functional, losing control, or having a health crisis.
We mentioned the downward arrow technique earlier, which therapists use to expose this core fear. Let's detail that conversation again for the listener, because it's such a powerful demonstration of how irrational the catastrophizing mechanism is.
So the therapist asks, what if I don't sleep tonight? And the insomnia brain answers, I won't be able to get my job done. The therapist follows up. And then what would be so bad about that? The answer, I'll get fired. And then what? I'll lose my house, I'll be homeless, or maybe I'll have a breakdown and end up in the hospital.
And the technique just keeps going until that core, often primal fear is revealed, the fear of total social or mental collapse. The power of the thought record is that it takes that extreme, terrifying fear out of the dark void of 2 a.m. and puts it onto paper in the daylight, where you can calmly examine the factual evidence against that extreme conclusion.
It forces a reality check. I mean, while you might be tired, how many people in history have lost their job and become homeless solely because of one bad night of sleep? The evidence shows the connection between a single sleepless night and total life destruction is well, it's virtually non-existent.
Next up, the sneaky self-fulfilling prophecy.
This is when that initial thought, often driven by catastrophizing, predicts a terrible day because of poor sleep, and then the person unconsciously approaches the day in a way that ensures the prediction comes true.
So the morning monologue is something like, I failed last night. I am useless and I can't concentrate. And since I'm useless, there's no point in even trying hard today. The result is minimal effort, self-sabotage, mistakes, missed opportunities, which then confirms the initial belief that they are, in fact, useless.
The mind creates a reality that's consistent with its beliefs. If you believe you will fail, you look for evidence of failure and you avoid activities that might prove you're competent. The thought record challenges this by identifying that initial destructive prediction and then forcing a plan for a neutral or even positive outcome instead.
And then there's the fear of social judgment, which is wrapped up in mind reading.
Mind reading is the belief that others are actively noticing your poor performance, your fatigue, your dark circles, all due to lack of sleep. And it fuels this intense fear of negative evaluation. The thought is often, everyone in this meeting can tell I only got 3 hours of sleep.
I think this is where I need to voice a challenge. When you are feeling terrible, it seems absolutely impossible that people aren't noticing.
That's the insomnia brain's projection. The evidence usually shows that most people are preoccupied with their own lives and their own challenges. Most people with insomnia function quite well, even if it requires extra effort for regular tasks. The challenge in the thought record is to ask, what hard evidence do I have that my boss or my colleague noticed and judged my sleep quality versus the evidence that they didn't mention it or were focused on the task at hand? The thought may feel true in your mind, but it's probably not 100% true in reality.
And that leads directly to overgeneralization.
Overgeneralization is taking a single negative event. Say, struggling with one question on a crossword puzzle, or stumbling over a word in a conversation, and assuming this proves a wider global incompetence, like, I am mentally useless at work now. The tendency is to focus only on limited evidence.
So you take one small piece of data and use it to form this rigid negative rule about your entire identity.
Yes. For example, I forgot one detail during a presentation which proves I can no longer handle complex tasks.
Sure.
The thought record forces you to look at the broader context. How many details did you remember? How many tasks did you complete successfully? You are forcing the perspective away from that limited negative evidence.
They're finally a close relative of generalization, discounting the positive exclusive, focusing on the negatives.
This is the active psychological mechanism of ignoring hundreds of instances where you coped, functioned well, and achieved success during the day, focusing only on that one missed appointment or that one minor failure. The insomnia brain acts like a highly selective editor, just redlining all the success stories.
The sources stress the need to review the whole day, not just the single slip-up. If you manage to work 8 hours, make lunch, and navigate traffic, that is successful coping, even if you felt tired. That's all evidence against the idea that you are dysfunctional.
Understanding these 8 cognitive errors is step 1. It gives you the language and the framework. Step 2 is using the thought record to break them down systematically, and by doing that, you disrupt the insomnia brain's negative operating system.
Okay, let's get really detailed on the actual structure of the thought record, because this is the skill that requires that repetitive practice. It's usually set up in 5 columns, and this is the work that ultimately trains your brain to replace those old, unhelpful thoughts with more accurate, balanced appraisals.
And the repetitive nature of this task is essential. You should think of it as physical training for your brain. You are literally building new neural pathways by repeatedly challenging those automatic negative thoughts.
Okay, so column 1 is the situation. This has to be an objective, factual description. Where were you and what were you doing when the feelings or thoughts started? No interpretation here, just the facts. For example, sitting at my desk trying to start a report, or lying in bed at 2 a.m. after waking up and immediately checking the clock.
And this is critical because it contextualizes the thought. If you notice the thought at 2 a.m., the situation is dark, quiet, and isolated, which inherently amplifies fear. Writing it down makes the situation manageable.
Right. Column 2 is the mood. You write down the kind of mood you're in: anxious, worried, down, frustrated, hopeless. And we emphasized this earlier, but it's worth repeating. You have to assign it a percentage intensity from 0 to 100%. Why is that quantification so important?
The quantification is essential for empirical self-assessment. The insomnia brain operates in extremes. It often tells you, I feel 100% anxious. By assigning a number, you're making the feeling measurable and therefore challengeable. Plus, We need to re-rate this number at the end. And if the cognitive work reduces your anxiety from, say, 85% down to 30%, you have measurable empirical proof that the cognitive strategy actually works, even if the sleep wasn't perfect.
Okay, so column 3 is the thoughts. This is where you write down the specific automatic thoughts you're having about your sleep problem. The sources encourage you to write them all down, even if they seem outlandish or silly when you look at them later. The goal is just to capture the unfiltered voice of the insomnia brain.
And these are the raw, catastrophic statements. I'm going to fail that presentation because of this lack of sleep, or I'm going to get sick if I keep going like this. By externalizing these thoughts onto paper, they lose some of their emotional power. They become objects you can examine, not internal facts you have to obey.
Column 4, I think, is the most difficult and the most critical step. Evidence for against the thought. This is where the real detective work begins. You have to look at the specific thought from column 3 and systematically list the evidence that supports it, the evidence for, and most importantly, the evidence that contradicts it, the evidence against.
And the challenge here is the severe confirmation bias of the insomnia brain. If the thought is, I'm never going to get through today, the evidence for might be, I only slept 3 hours and I spilled my coffee this morning. The brain automatically highlights these two negative data points.
And the listener, feeling exhausted, genuinely struggles to find anything positive. They might feel like they're lying to themselves by looking for evidence against. So what kind of small, almost trivial evidence should we be looking for to counteract that extreme negative?
You have to actively search for that counter evidence, even the mundane stuff. If the thought is catastrophic failure, the evidence against has to be realistic coping. For instance, I successfully drove to work without incident. I managed to compose 3 complex emails. My colleague told me my proposal was good. Or, I had insomnia last Tuesday too, and I still made it through the whole day and finished my tasks. You're listing times you perform neutrally or even well after a poor night's sleep.
So you're forcing the insomnia brain to review the whole story, not just the heavily edited negative version. The evidence against the thought forces the brain to focus on accuracy and balance rather than just panic.
And that balance leads directly to column 5, adaptive coping statement and re-rating. Based on the balanced evidence you gather in column 4, you construct a new, more accurate, and helpful appraisal of the situation. This statement is the key takeaway. It should lie somewhere in the middle of the emotional extremes.
It's the truth rather than the catastrophe. So if the original thought was, I'm going to ruin my career because I'm so tired, the adaptive statement needs to be really realistic.
A good adaptive statement might be something like, I'm feeling groggy right now, which is unpleasant, but I have a proven track record of completing my work successfully, even after poor sleep. I will proceed calmly and focus on one task at a time, just like I did last week. It accepts the feeling, the grogginess, but it challenges the extreme conclusion ruining the career. It's rational self-talk based on data.
And the final crucial step in column 5, you re-rate the mood intensity. Did that new, rational, data-driven appraisal actually reduce your anxiety or frustration? A documented shift from 80% anxiety down to 25% anxiety is measurable proof that the cognitive restructuring worked, regardless of how many hours you slept.
And this is a skill that requires repetitive practice, sometimes daily, over 2 weeks or more. The goal is to internalize this process so that when the insomnia brain throws an automatic thought at you at 2 a.m., your mind reflexively responds with the balanced, adaptive appraisal you've practiced hundreds of times.
It sounds like you're redirecting all that anxiety-fueled energy into structured self-analysis. You are achieving mastery over the insomnia brain, step by step, by challenging these unhelpful and inflexible thoughts and beliefs about sleep.
We've covered the quick behavioral fix with stimulus control, the scheduled worry dump with constructive worry, and the daily belief challenge with the thought record. Now, I think we should talk about how we finalize this mastery by testing the beliefs that are the most rigid.
The journey to overcoming insomnia. It's often less about the inability to sleep and much more about overcoming the fear and distress surrounding that inability. The sources have given us 3 core interlocking strategies for managing this insomnia brain and the mental arousal it causes.
1. Leave the room temporarily when your mind is active. Use stimulus control to make sure the bed is only a signal for sleep. 2. Use constructive worry in the late afternoon to manage the day's unfinished business so worries don't spill over into the night.
And 3. Use thought records daily to challenge persistent feelings or automatic thoughts about sleep and replace them with accurate, data-driven appraisals. This is really the mechanism for achieving cognitive mastery.
Now, a critical point that's acknowledged in the sources is that some people might feel resistant or skeptical about these structured techniques. They might genuinely believe their catastrophic thoughts are 100% true.
Hmm.
The cognitive approach doesn't argue with that belief directly, which is where a lot of self-help approaches fail. Instead, we use a concept called collective empiricism.
That concept is brilliant. It means using your own experience and your own existing data, often gathered through sleep diaries or daily logs, to explore the validity of your belief, rather than just having a therapist or, us argue that the belief is wrong.
If a listener deeply believes that they never cope well after a bad night's sleep, the response isn't to dismiss that. The response is, okay, let's review the last 3 weeks of your sleep diary. Tell me about the day you only got 2 hours of sleep. What work tasks did you actually complete? Did anyone criticize your performance? The person's own recorded evidence often contradicts the extreme belief, and that starts to erode the certainty of the insomnia brain.
And that leads directly to the most advanced technique we should discuss: behavioral experiments. This takes that empirical data collection one step further by allowing you to design a simple experiment to directly test a deeply held, often rigid, belief.
Behavioral experiments are so powerful because they allow you to actively disprove your own rigid belief in a controlled way. Let's take the example of napping. A deeply held belief might be that sleep quality is poor and fatigue is higher when a nap is used to recover. The insomnia brain insists on this.
So how would the listener set up that experiment?
Well, they would design a simple A/B test. For the first week, condition A, they strictly avoid naps, and they track their fatigue levels and their overall sleep quality each night. For the second week, condition B, they intentionally include a 30-minute nap and again, track the same metrics. They then compare the data. If the data shows no difference, or even an improvement, the rigid belief about napping is weakened, not because a doctor said so, but because their own body provided the counter evidence.
That's truly empowering. Another common one is testing the belief that when you're feeling completely exhausted from lack of sleep, you have to rest and conserve every single ounce of energy. The insomnia brain says, lie on the couch or you will crash.
Right. And the behavioral experiment would test that assumption. So for 3 days, when they wake up feeling exhausted, they would intentionally choose to keep active go for a short walk, stay engaged in a mildly stimulating activity. Then on the next 3 days they feel exhausted, they would strictly rest. And they track their perceived energy levels at the end of each day.
And often, the sources show they discover that keeping active actually conserves mental energy better, contrary to their belief that total rest was necessary. The physical activity disrupts the mental focus on fatigue.
These experiments push back against the rigid assumptions that lock the insomnia brain into its negative pattern. They force you, the listener, to recognize that you have a choice in how you respond to negative thoughts. You shift your focus from what you can't do, which is force sleep, to what you can do, which is establish new behavioral and thinking habits.
So you're not just trying to treat the symptom of sleeplessness. You are systematically dismantling the entire mental architecture that perpetuates the cycle. The effort here is about mastery over your own internal experience.
The most profound insight from the sources is that this entire process is about recognizing that your beliefs are not facts, and that the emotional arousal caused by your rigid thinking interferes directly with the chemistry you need for sleep.
So what does this all mean for you as you finish this deep dive and prepare to implement these strategies?
It means taking control of the narrative. You've identified the insomnia brain, you've learned how to manage the immediate worry, and now you know how to challenge those catastrophic thoughts.
So here is our final provocative thought for you to consider this week, based on all the material we've covered. Which of your current, deeply held beliefs about sleep, that feeling that you are going to be non-functional or sick or incompetent, is actually a prediction you are unconsciously helping to fulfill?
Identify that self-fulfilling prophecy, use the constructive worry sheet to clear your mind, and start using the thought record to gather evidence against your fear. That is how you break the cycle and stop the insomnia brain from winning the night.
Thank you for joining us for the deep dive. We look forward to diving into the next stack of sources with you next time.